The plane wheels hit the tarmac with a jolt that pulled me out of my thoughts. My heart was pounding so loud it almost drowned out the captain's welcome message. I looked out the window, but everything outside seemed blurry. Not from the altitude, not from the weather. From my eyes, fogged with tears I had tried hard not to cry. I was finally in the United States. After 12 long years without seeing my daughter. 12 years of birthdays over phone calls, of missing the first steps of my grandchildren, of celebrating milestones through photos on WhatsApp. 12 years of saving every coin, sewing until my fingers bled, selling handmade soaps in the town square just to send her money so she could build a better life abroad. Inside my worn leather purse were two things that weighed more than the plane itself. A bundle of family photos from the 90s, some already faded, and a folded envelope with my daughter's address, handwritten in blue ink, her handwriting, her name next to a house number that I'd imagined 1,000 times. I stepped off the plane with trembling knees, gripping my documents like they could vanish at any second. The immigration line was long, but I waited patiently. When the officer asked my reason for visiting, I smiled as big as I could and said, "To visit my daughter and grandchildren." He nodded, stamped my passport, and let me through. That moment should have been a victory. It should have tasted like hope, but something in my chest was already off. A tiny crack that I ignored. I walked into the arrivals terminal, searching the crowd with hungry eyes. I imagined her there, waving both hands, pushing through people to hug me. My daughter with her 2 children running ahead, yelling "Abuela" like in the movies. But no one came. I stood by the sliding doors for 20 minutes, pretending I was just early. Then I called the number she gave me. No answer. Second try. Voicemail. Finally, she answered. "Mom, we thought your flight was tomorrow," she said, voice low, hurried. I heard a man in the background. I couldn't make out the words, just the tone, annoyed. She told me to take a taxi, said she'd text the address again just in case. Her voice was different, sharper, less warm than I remembered, but I told myself she was just surprised, caught off guard. I held onto that thought like a lifeline as I walked outside, dragging my suitcase behind me, wobbling on unfamiliar pavement. The cab ride was quiet. I didn't speak English well enough to chat, and the driver didn't speak Spanish. I showed him the address, and we drove through neighborhoods I only knew from Google Earth. They were more real now. Trees were turning orange, Halloween decorations on porches, kids on bicycles, people walking dogs in puffer jackets. Everything looked so peaceful, but inside me was a storm. When we pulled up to the house, I had to ask the driver twice if it was the right one. It didn't look like the photos. It was bigger, cleaner, modern. My daughter had done well. That made me proud, but it also made me nervous. I had packed tortillas in foil, a jar of homemade jam, a tiny Virgin Mary statue. What if those things embarrassed her? I paid the driver, took a deep breath, and walked up the steps. I rang the bell, and I waited and waited. The wind picked up, rustling the trees. A neighbor across the street was mowing his lawn, looking up briefly when he saw me. Still no answer. I rang again. I was about to knock when the door finally opened. A boy, maybe 8 years old, stood there. Freckles, light hair. He looked like her, but he didn't smile, just stared. Behind him, I heard voices, then footsteps, then silence. My daughter came into view wearing gym clothes and holding her phone. "Mom, you're early," she said, forcing a smile. Her hug was short, her arms stiff, like she was hugging someone she didn't want to touch. The house smelled like air freshener and new furniture. No trace of cinnamon or rice, pudding, or anything that once meant home. I stepped inside slowly, clutching my purse with both hands. She told me to leave my shoes by the door. I did. I always tried to be respectful. She took my suitcase wordlessly and pointed to a guest room down the hall. There were white sheets, a lamp. Everything was perfect, coldly perfect. She said she had to get back to something and disappeared. I was alone, in that spotless house, in that quiet. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at my hands. These same hands that raised her, that worked for her, that fed her. I had crossed a continent to see her face again, but already I felt like I had walked into the wrong story. It's strange. You think you're coming home to your own daughter, but sometimes you arrive and realize she's not waiting for you, that maybe she never was. If you've ever felt this kind of silence from someone you love, if you've ever knocked on a door that should have opened with love and found something else entirely, tell me in the comments below. Right, I felt this too. Your voice might comfort someone who thinks they're alone. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe to the channel. Not because I'm asking, but because every subscription keeps these stories alive. keeps voices like mine from disappearing, keeps memories from being erased. We deserve to be remembered. The hallway was narrow and silent, but it echoed like a cathedral. Every step I took sounded too loud against the polished floor. I tried to keep my footsteps soft, to blend into the quietness of the house, but it was impossible. My shoes felt heavy, like I was dragging shame behind me. I didn't know why, but something in my chest started to tighten. I passed by a family photo on the wall. My daughter, her husband, their 2 children, all dressed in matching clothes, sitting on a picnic blanket with a pumpkin beside them. Everyone smiling, everyone clean and polished. But I wasn't in that photo, not even in the background, not a single trace of me. It was like I didn't exist. I followed the smell of artificial lavender toward the living room, where I saw the back of the man she married. He was on the couch, legs stretched out, phone in hand, scrolling with the boredom of someone too used to being served. He didn't turn around when I entered. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but then I heard it. "She's still alive?" It was said so casually, so flat, so cold, like I was a pest that had overstayed its welcome. My ears burned, my heart skipped a beat, my fingers trembled as I instinctively looked toward my daughter, hoping she would correct him, defend me, say it was a joke, say he meant something else. But she said nothing. She was in the kitchen, silently unpacking groceries, pretending not to hear. My body froze. That sentence looped in my mind like a broken song. She's still alive. Not "she's here," not "how is she," but "she's still alive." The words cut through me deeper than any insult. I had imagined this visit as a reunion, a moment to remember love. But what I walked into was a home where I was an unwanted ghost. I sat down on a stiff armchair, careful not to wrinkle the throw blanket that matched the color scheme. Everything in that house was beige, white, soft gray, clean lines, modern furniture, no clutter, no memories, no warmth. I placed my purse on my lap, hands folded. My daughter brought me a glass of water, placed it on the coffee table, and walked away again. Her husband glanced at me once. No smile, no greeting, just a look that made me feel like I had brought dust into his perfect world. Later that evening, as we sat around the table, I noticed how distant the kids were. They didn't speak Spanish. They didn't understand me. My daughter never taught them. They didn't even call me abuela. I was just Grandma from Mexico, a title that floated awkwardly whenever they asked questions. I tried to ask them what they liked to do, tried to show them the little wooden toys I brought. They looked at me, confused. One of them laughed, not with me, at me. And then, my daughter stepped in quickly. "Don't bother her too much," she said in English. "She's tired. She had a long flight." Her eyes didn't meet mine. That night, I lay in the guest room. The bed was clean, the sheets were soft, but I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and listened. The house was quiet, but not in a comforting way. It was the kind of silence that isolates, that separates, that reminds you you're not wanted. I could hear murmurs through the thin wall. My daughter and her husband talking. I caught fragments. "She can't stay too long. I don't want problems with immigration. What if the neighbors find out?" Every word felt like a slow blade. I came to bring memories. I brought recipes. I brought photo albums. I brought pieces of a life they no longer wanted. But they were throwing it all away, quietly, behind closed doors. If you've ever walked into a place expecting love and found distance instead, if you've ever heard something that shattered your spirit in a single sentence, I want you to leave a comment. Just write, "I've been silenced too." You never know who might be reading, who might find strength in your words. And if these stories resonate with you, if they reflect a reality that too many still try to ignore, I invite you to subscribe, not as a number, but as someone who believes our stories matter. Every person who joins this channel becomes a witness, a protector of memories that shouldn't be erased. Thank you for being here. I still remember the night my daughter told me she wanted to leave. She was only 18, but her eyes had already outgrown the walls of our small kitchen in Michoacan. It was after dinner. I was washing the dishes, and she was sitting at the table, peeling an orange. She didn't look at me when she said it, just stared at the fruit in her hands and whispered, "Mama, I want to go to the United States." I felt, the plate slip slightly from my soapy hands. I didn't say anything right away. I kept washing. The silence was my only armor, because deep down, I had always known this moment would come. She wanted more, and how could I blame her? We lived in a village where dreams didn't grow past the town square, where the biggest accomplishment was surviving. I had raised her to dream, even when I didn't know it. I had pushed her in school, told her stories of women who became something more, kept her away, from boys who would have clipped her wings too early. I wanted her to have a life I couldn't even imagine for myself. So I said yes. I helped her apply for a student visa. I sold my sewing machine. I borrowed money from a neighbor. I cried alone at night, but smiled during the day. I told her she was brave. I told her she was ready. And when I hugged her goodbye at the bus station, I whispered in her ear, "Don't forget where you come from." I worked every day to send her money. At first, it was just enough for groceries and rent, then for books, then for clothes, for interviews. When she landed her first job at a real estate office, I celebrated by buying myself a single chocolate bar. That was all I could afford, but it tasted like victory. She called every Sunday. We talked about everything: the weather, the food, her classes, her new friends. She would tell me about the city, about how big everything was, how fast life moved. I would listen and smile, feeling like I had sent a little piece of myself into a better world. But as the years passed, her voice changed. The calls became shorter. She stopped asking about people from our village. She stopped using Spanish as often. She began to laugh at things I didn't understand. At first, I thought it was just the stress of growing up. Then I realized she was becoming someone else. I kept sending money, even when I had nothing, even when I had to pretend I wasn't hungry so I could pay for her new shoes or her rent, even when I had to say no to a new pair of glasses for myself because she needed a laptop. I told everyone in the village how proud I was. I told them my daughter was making it in America. I carried a photo of her graduation in my wallet, showed it to anyone who would look. I bragged about her job, her apartment, her car, even when I didn't know if she still thought about me at all. When she got married, I wasn't there. She told me she didn't want a big wedding, said it was going to be something small, just civil. But I saw the pictures later, the flowers, the white dress, the guests. I wasn't invited, not even through a screen. That was the first time it hit me that she was building a life where I didn't fit. Still, I kept loving her, because that's what mothers do. We keep loving even when it hurts. We keep giving even when we're empty. We keep believing in the child we once held, even when they forget the warmth of our arms. And now, here I was, sitting in the guest room of her American dream, and realizing I had become part of a past she had erased. Nothing on the walls reminded me of home. No family photos that included me. Not even a souvenir from the country that gave her birth. She didn't ask me to cook. She didn't ask for stories. She didn't ask me how I was. I was a visitor, a stranger, an inconvenience. I saw the way she avoided speaking Spanish in front of her husband. I noticed how her voice changed when she answered the phone. Polite, polished, almost British. I wanted to say, "Speak to me like you used to," but I stayed quiet. I didn't want to embarrass her. At dinner, she served pasta with white sauce. Not a tortilla in sight. No beans, no rice. I offered to cook the next day, but she said they didn't really eat that kind of food anymore. I nodded and smiled. Then later, I cried in the bathroom with the faucet running so they wouldn't hear me. I tried to tell myself that maybe she just needed time, that maybe reconnecting after so many years was harder than I thought. But I also knew that something inside her had shifted too far, that the woman sitting across from me was not the same girl who used to braid my hair while I read her stories before bed. She had changed, and I didn't recognize who she became. But what hurt the most was knowing that she no longer recognized me either. If you've ever watched someone you love slowly drift into a person you can't reach anymore, if you've ever wondered when exactly they stopped seeing you as home, I'd like you to share your story in the comments. Write, "I miss who they used to be." It might help someone else understand they're not the only one. And if this story has made you feel seen, I invite you to stay connected. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that stories like ours deserve to be heard. Every time you do, you're helping protect memories that are too often forgotten. Thank you for being part of this space. Everything about her life now felt like a carefully staged play. From the pristine curtains to the minimalist decor, nothing in that house breathed. There were no photo frames of her childhood, no school awards, no little paper flowers I used to make with her for Dia de las Madres, no traces of who she used to be. Her living room could have been featured in a magazine. Beige, metallic, spotless, beautiful, yes, but hollow, sterile. It felt more like a showroom than a home. She had become someone else. Her name was still the same on paper, but everything else had been peeled away, layer by layer. She called herself Emma now. Not Amelia, not even Emily, just Emma, clean, American. When she said it aloud, it sounded foreign to me, as if her own name had become something she needed to hide. At first, I thought it was just adaptation, that maybe she was doing what she had to do to fit in, but the truth sank in deeper each day. She wasn't adapting. She was erasing. She had traded her heritage for silence, her roots for respectability, her accent for approval. One morning, as I sat on the patio with my coffee, I heard her neighbor call her name. "Emma," he waved, smiling. She waved back with that polished, almost rehearsed smile. I said nothing. I just watched her pretend, watched her float in a life where I no longer had a place. She rarely spoke Spanish anymore, only when forced, and even then, it was broken, stripped. When she introduced me to someone at the grocery store, she didn't say I was her mother. She said I was visiting from Mexico, like a distant cousin, like a distant memory. Her children didn't speak our language. She never taught them. I asked once gently, "Why not?" She shrugged and said, "They're American, Mama. What would they need Spanish for?" I stared at her in disbelief. Our language, our songs, our stories, all gone, because she had decided they didn't belong in this version of her life. She corrected my pronunciation when I spoke English, not kindly, not to help, but to signal, gently and firmly, that I did not belong in her world. One night, I was trying to tell a story at dinner, something funny about when she was little. I said it in Spanish, because that's how the memory lived in my heart. Her husband leaned back in his chair and asked her what I was saying. She rolled her eyes and replied, "Nothing important." Then they changed the subject. I felt myself shrinking, becoming smaller in a room I had never been invited to in the first place. There were rules in her house. No shoes, no loud voices, no strong cooking smells. I learned to tiptoe, to smile quietly, to be polite in a place that was supposed to be mine too. One day, I tried to fry plantains, just something small, something familiar. She came into the kitchen and said, "Mama, that smell stays in the curtains for days." So I stopped. I poured the oil out. I opened windows. I apologized. It was not just the food. It was the music, the way I dressed, even the way I folded the towels. Everything I did reminded her of something she didn't want to be. She wasn't ashamed of me out loud. She would never say that. But shame has a smell. It has a silence. It has a way of slipping between words. You know when you're being hidden. And I knew. Once, I brought out the photo album I had carried all the way in my suitcase. Pages of her childhood, birthdays, school plays, our little house with the cracked walls and the rose bush she planted with her own hands. I placed it on the coffee table, waited for her to sit down beside me, but she never did. She passed by once, twice, then picked it up, closed it, and said, "Let's not leave this out. The kids will get it sticky." I watched her tuck it away in a drawer, out of sight, out of reach. She had built a life so far from who she was that my presence alone felt like a threat, a reminder of the journey she was trying to forget. I didn't want to ruin her new life. I came only to visit, to feel loved, to see the children. But I could tell that just by being there, I had already asked too much. If you've ever been made to feel like your love is an inconvenience, like your history is something to be managed and boxed away, I want you to say something today. Write, "I am not a secret." Your comment may be the voice someone else needs to feel seen. You matter. You always have. And if this story reminds you of something you've lived or something you fear, I ask you to subscribe. This space is for truth, for memory, for stories that deserve more than silence. Thank you for being here. He never looked me in the eyes, not once. From the moment I entered that house until the day everything unraveled, my daughter's husband treated me like a piece of furniture that somehow kept getting in his way. His presence filled every corner of the home like a smell you cannot name, but you know does not belong to you. He was the kind of man who always had something in his hand, a phone, a tablet, a remote, rarely a smile. He moved through the house like he owned the air everyone breathed, like the silence was arranged just for him. When he spoke, it was not with kindness or warmth. His voice carried a tone that never had room for anyone else's story, especially not mine. On the first day, I tried to greet him properly. I reached out my hand and said, "Mucho gusto," with the little English I had. He looked at my hand, then at my face, then walked past me. No words, no handshake, just the sound of his socks brushing across the floor. I told myself maybe he was busy, maybe shy, but it was neither. It was control. It was dismissal. At dinner, he barely acknowledged my presence. He made comments in English that I could not understand completely, but I felt the weight of them in my bones. One night, when my daughter stepped away from the table, I caught a fragment of his whisper on the phone. "This is not what I signed up for." I froze. I didn't know if he was talking about me, but everything inside me knew that he was. He didn't like my accent. He didn't like how I looked. My clothes were too colorful, my laugh too loud, my hands too worn. I was the opposite of everything he expected to find in the life he built with my daughter. He had married a woman who had erased her past so well, he forgot she had a mother. And now that I was in his home, I was proof that she once came from somewhere else. Somewhere brown, somewhere poor, somewhere inconvenient. He spoke about immigration in front of me, carelessly, like it was dinner conversation. He'd mention stories from the news, use words like illegals and drains on the system while buttering his toast. I sat in silence, my heart racing, my hands clenched under the table. My daughter never said a word to stop him. She stirred her coffee and stared at the wall. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen and overheard him talking to her. His voice was low but sharp. "Why is she still here?" she said one week. My daughter whispered something back that I couldn't catch. He replied, louder this time, "I don't want her here when the neighbors come for the barbecue." Then he added something I will never forget. "We don't need people asking questions." I stood there holding a dish towel in my hand, unable to move. A question. That is what I had become. Not a mother, not a guest, a problem to be solved. That night I could not sleep. I lay in the dark, eyes wide open, listening to the muffled sounds of the television downstairs. A commercial in English, a laugh track, then silence, then a door closing. I thought about leaving, about taking my things and walking into the night. But where would I go? I didn't know this country. I didn't even know how to call a cab. He began locking his office door during the day, the same office where my daughter said I could leave my suitcase when I arrived. One afternoon, I went to get my charger and found the door locked. I asked her why. She said he was just organizing some things. But I knew. He was creating distance, barriers, lines I was no longer allowed to cross. He didn't have to tell me I was unwelcome. His silence did it for him. His glances, his sighs, his polite cruelty. Once I tried to cook something simple, just rice and eggs. He walked into the kitchen, sniffed the air and said, "Smells like a food truck." Then he left. My daughter laughed nervously. "He's just tired," she said. But she didn't defend me, not even once. I began to count the hours, not the days. The hours until I could go back. I felt like I was living in a house where the walls listened more than the people did. One evening, I sat with the children in the living room. They were watching cartoons. I offered to braid my granddaughter's hair. She said she didn't like braids. I smiled and said, "I used to braid her mother's hair every morning before school." Her brother asked, "Did Mom go to school here?" My granddaughter answered, before I could speak, "No, she's not from here. But we don't talk about that." My heart cracked. In those few words, I realized how deep the silence had grown. It wasn't just my daughter. It had spread to the next generation. A quiet, careful erasing of everything that came before. If you have ever been treated like a burden inside a family you helped build, if you have ever felt the air change when you walk into a room, please leave a comment. Just write, "I deserve to be respected." Let that be your voice today. Let that be your stand. And if these moments feel familiar to you, if you believe no one should have to question their worth inside their own family, consider subscribing. This channel is for every heart that's been made to feel small, for every story pushed into silence. You are not alone here. The house was unusually quiet that morning. Too quiet. Not the kind of quiet that brings peace, but the kind that wraps around you like a warning. The kids were at school. My daughter had left for work. Her husband was gone too. I stood in the middle of the living room holding my cup of coffee, untouched and already cold, listening to the silence that seemed to hum with something I could not name. There was a note on the counter, her handwriting again, small, distant. "There is food in the fridge. We'll be back late. Make yourself comfortable." I read it twice. I placed it down carefully like it was fragile. The words didn't feel like an invitation. They felt like a wall. I decided to clean a little. Maybe it would help me feel useful. That's what I had always done. When things felt wrong, I scrubbed, I folded, I made order out of chaos. I wiped down the table, fluffed the pillows, watered the plants. I even folded the blanket on the couch exactly how I had seen her do it. A small offering, a silent apology for being too present in a place that didn't want my presence. Then the phone rang. It was the landline, an old-fashioned sound in a modern house. I hesitated. Who even called on those anymore? But something in me said to answer. I picked it up, my voice trembling. "Hello?" The voice on the other end spoke English. Fast, official, too fast for me to catch everything. But I heard my name. I heard the word immigration, and I heard the click of the line disconnecting. I stood there frozen, my hand still holding the receiver, my heart now thudding in my chest like a warning drum. Immigration? Why? How? I was here legally. I had my tourist visa, my passport, my entry stamp. I had done nothing wrong. I walked back to the guest room and opened the drawer where I kept my documents. Everything was there, neatly packed, untouched. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding my passport like it could protect me, like it had the power to explain. My eyes kept darting to the front window. The street outside looked normal. A neighbor mowing the lawn, a jogger passing by, a delivery truck slowing to a stop 2 houses down. But my body knew something was coming, the kind of knowing only a mother understands. A storm you can't see but feel in your bones. 30 minutes passed, maybe more. Then the doorbell rang. I walked slowly to the door, my hands damp with sweat, my knees weak. Through the peephole, I saw 2 men in dark jackets. They were not in uniform, but I could read the letters on their badges. ICE. I opened the door halfway. One of them held up an ID. "Ma'am, we received a report. We need to verify your immigration status." My tongue felt like it didn't work. I handed over my documents with shaking fingers. They took them, flipped through them, asked me questions. Where was I staying? How long had I been here? Who was I visiting? I answered everything truthfully, my voice barely above a whisper. They looked at each other. Then one of them said, "We need you to come with us to clarify some things at the office, just for routine questions." I asked if I could call my daughter. They paused. Then one of them said, "She's aware." And that was the moment I understood. It was not a mistake. It was not bad timing. It was not a random check. Someone had called them. Someone had reported me. And the only people who knew I was staying here were in this house. I didn't cry. Not then. There is a kind of pain that is too deep for tears. A betrayal so complete, it stuns you into silence. I walked with them out of the house, past the photos on the wall that didn't include me, past the kitchen where I had once tried to cook, past the couch where no one ever invited me to sit. I stepped into their car and watched the house grow smaller behind me. I was not scared in the way people imagine. I was something worse. I was invisible, disposable. I was no longer a person. I was a problem to be removed quietly and quickly. Inside the immigration office, they asked more questions, took my fingerprints again, took my picture, a mugshot. I had never even gotten a parking ticket in my life, but now I was being treated like a criminal. One of the officers spoke Spanish. He explained that I was being detained until they could confirm some details about my visa. I told him I had nothing to hide. He nodded, but his eyes didn't offer comfort. They placed me in a small room, cold, white, no windows, a plastic chair, a table, a camera in the corner. I sat there for what felt like hours. No one called, no one came. No one from the house asked about me. I was a forgotten suitcase, a souvenir that had become inconvenient. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you love, if you've ever had your dignity stripped in a place where you were supposed to be safe, I want to hear your voice. Write, "I know how that feels," in the comments. Let this be a space where the silenced can speak. And if this story touched something inside you, if you believe stories like mine should not be hidden away, please subscribe. Together, we protect memories that others try to erase. Together we say, we are still here. Thank you for listening. The transport van was colder than the room they had kept me in. Metal walls, no windows, just a tiny grated opening at the back. I sat in the middle bench, clutching my purse like a child holds a blanket. Inside it were the only things I had brought across that border. My passport, a small notebook, a picture of my daughter when she was 10, and one plastic rosary that I had tucked into the lining of my suitcase, now wrapped around my fingers like armor. We rode in silence. I was too afraid to ask where they were taking me. I knew, deep down, it didn't matter. Because wherever I was going, it would not be home. And I had already realized that what I thought was home had rejected me before I even knocked on the door. When we arrived, I had to remove my shoes, my earrings. They took my fingerprints again, asked more questions. But the one that kept ringing in my ears wasn't from the officers. It was the one I had overheard that day, from the man sitting in the house I had helped build from across oceans. The voice of my daughter's husband, asking, "She's still alive?" It clung to me like a shadow, following me into that sterile building. The detention center was not what I had imagined. It looked more like a warehouse than a prison. The walls were too white, as if trying to erase something. The air was dry, filled with the sharp scent of bleach and something else, something that lingered behind the cleanliness, hopelessness. They gave me a uniform, light blue pants, a gray shirt. I had to sign a form to receive it. I did not understand every word, but I signed anyway. Because what choice did I have? My bunk was in a shared room with 7 other women. Metal beds stacked in twos, one thin mattress, one folded blanket, no privacy, no softness. One woman looked up at me as I walked in. She nodded. I nodded back. No one asked why I was there. You could tell that everyone already knew. We were all different. Different faces, different languages, different reasons. But we all carried the same silence, the silence of being unwanted. That first night, I barely slept. The lights never fully turned off, just dimmed. There was a loudspeaker that cracked every hour with announcements in English. The guards' radios buzzed. Keys jingled constantly. The air conditioner was always on. I pulled the thin blanket up to my neck and stared at the ceiling, counting every sound, every second. At one point, I turned toward the wall and whispered my daughter's name. I wasn't even sure why. Maybe hoping that somehow, across distance, across shame, she would hear me. The second day, a woman from Haiti shared her crackers with me. She said nothing, just placed them next to my hand while we sat on the edge of our bunks. That moment, so small, so quiet, meant more than 1,000 apologies. Because it was the first act of kindness I had received in days. Later that day, one of the officers mentioned that I had a visitor scheduled for the next morning. I thought maybe my daughter had changed her mind. Maybe the guilt had softened her heart. Maybe my grandchildren had asked where I was. I allowed myself to hope, just a little, just enough to keep breathing. When I walked into the visitor room, I saw a young woman I had never met. She wore glasses and carried a folder under her arm. Her name was Kelly. She was a volunteer with an immigrant support network. She spoke Spanish, clear, calm, with warmth in her voice. She explained that someone had called their hotline anonymously, that they had heard an elderly woman was being detained without family support, that it might be a case of abuse or family neglect. Kelly looked me in the eye and said, "I believe you deserve to be heard." I could not speak. My throat closed up with gratitude. She placed a small notebook in front of me and said, "Write down what you remember, every detail. We will try to help." I asked if she had spoken to my daughter. Kelly said no. There had been no contact, no request for updates, no messages asking if I was safe. That confirmation hurt more than anything else, because deep down I had still believed she might come, that some part of her still saw me, still loved me. But silence, when you expect a voice, is its own kind of violence. Back in my bunk, I opened the notebook and began to write, slowly, carefully. I wrote in Spanish because it was the only language that still felt like mine. I wrote about raising my daughter alone, about the meals I skipped so she could eat, about how she cried the night before her first trip to the city, how I had promised her she was meant for something bigger. I wrote about how I had celebrated her success from afar, about the countless boxes I had sent, filled with little reminders of home, about how I believed that my sacrifices meant something, that they had built something good. And then I wrote about that hallway, that moment, that voice, "She's still alive," and how those 4 words split my world in two. Kelly came back the next day. She read my notes. She placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "You are not alone." Then she told me about an immigration lawyer who might be able to help. Her name was Diana. She worked with women who had been victims of family betrayal, financial abuse, and manipulation. Kelly believed I had a case, that what had happened to me was not just wrong, it was cruel. I looked at her and asked, "Will they let me go?" She didn't lie. She said, "It won't be easy, but we will try." If you have ever sat in a room and realized that the people who should have protected you were the ones who hurt you most, I want you to leave a comment. Write, "I see my truth." Let those words be your way of saying you matter, because you do. And if this story has echoed something inside you, please consider subscribing, not just for me, but for all the voices that have been silenced behind doors and policies and shame. Your presence here is proof that stories like mine will not disappear. Thank you for standing with me. There was something surreal about sitting across from a lawyer while wearing a uniform that wasn't mine. The room had no windows, just a flickering light above and a metal table between us. Diana, the attorney Kelly had connected me with, had kind eyes, not soft but focused, the kind of eyes that have seen too much and still choose to fight. She laid out papers in front of me, documents filled with lines and codes I didn't understand. She spoke slowly, carefully, making sure I grasped every word. Her Spanish was fluent, precise, respectful. It had been days since anyone had spoken to me like that, like I was a person. She explained that there were legal pathways to challenge my detention. That family betrayal, especially when tied to immigration manipulation, was more common than people realized. She had worked on similar cases, elderly women brought to the U.S. under the promise of family reunion only to be abandoned, or worse, reported. I didn't want to believe that my own daughter had knowingly done this, that she had allowed her husband to make the call. But every piece of logic, every missing phone call, every silent day in detention pointed to one painful truth. They had wanted me gone. Diana asked me questions that were hard to answer, about the way I had been treated in the house, about whether I had been denied food, privacy, or dignity, about what I had overheard. I answered everything, even when my voice trembled, even when the words felt like they were cutting my tongue. At one point, she asked, "Did she ever make threats? Even subtle ones?" I paused. Then I remembered. I remembered the time she said, "This country isn't like Mexico, Mama. You can't just do what you want." The way she said it, cold, detached, like a warning, like a reminder that I was no longer on solid ground. I remembered her husband saying, "If anything goes wrong, we'll handle it." And the way he emphasized, "we," as if I was not part of that equation, as if I had never been. Diana nodded as I spoke. She wasn't surprised. That hurt more than anything, because it meant this was not rare. It meant I was not the first mother cast aside in the name of reinvention. She told me we would file for what is known as humanitarian parole, that we would use my age, my medical needs, and the clear signs of emotional abuse to plead for my release while the case was reviewed. She asked if I had any health conditions. I told her about my blood pressure, my migraines, my old back injury from sewing 12 hours a day for over 30 years. We needed proof, but how do you prove you were erased? Kelly brought me more paper. I wrote everything, every memory, every sentence they spoke, every moment I felt unwanted. I wrote until my wrist hurt, until the pen ran out of ink, until the words stopped feeling like mine and became something I had to carry for others too. The other women in detention started to notice I had visitors, that I had people asking questions. Some approached me softly. One asked if my daughter knew I was here. I said yes. She looked down and said, "Mine too." We were mothers, wives, sisters, women who had crossed oceans not to invade, but to love, to give, to belong. And somehow our stories had been turned into crimes. One morning I was called to the front office. My name over the loudspeaker, mispronounced but still mine. My hands shook as I walked down the hallway. Diana was waiting with a small smile, a cautious one. She had news. The request had been granted. Temporary release, under supervision, pending further hearings. But I would not spend another night on that metal bed. I signed forms again. I promised not to leave the city. I gave them an address, the address Kelly had found for me, a small shared house for women in transition. Not glamorous, not perfect, but safe. They gave me back my clothes, my purse, my notebook, my rosary. They did not give me back the days I had lost, the dignity that had been taken, but they gave me the door, and I walked through it. When I stepped outside, the sun hit my face like a rebirth. I tilted my head up and let it warm my cheeks. I was not free, not entirely, but I was no longer invisible. The ride to the shelter was quiet. Kelly sat beside me in the front seat, humming a soft melody I didn't recognize. I watched the city pass by. Billboards, traffic, children with backpacks, men walking dogs, people living normal lives while I carried a story they would never hear. The shelter was simple, a 2-story house with a small porch and wind chimes that sang gently in the breeze. Inside, the walls were lined with messages written by women who had stayed before me, words in Spanish, Tagalog, Swahili, Arabic, all saying the same thing in different ways. You are not alone. They gave me a room, a bed with a real blanket, a small lamp, a chair. I sat down and cried for the first time in weeks, not because I was broken, but because for the first time, I didn't have to pretend I was okay. I called no one. My phone had no numbers saved anymore. No messages from my daughter, no missed calls, just silence. That night, I cooked for the house. Simple food, rice, beans, plantains, a little salsa, nothing fancy. But the smell filled the kitchen like a memory. One woman said it reminded her of her mother. Another said she hadn't tasted warmth in a long time. I smiled. I didn't say much. I just kept stirring the pot. If you've ever had to start over from nothing, if you've ever rebuilt yourself from the ashes of someone else's silence, write in the comments, "I'm still standing." Let the world see you. Let yourself be seen. And if you want to walk alongside stories like mine, Please subscribe to this channel, not for me, for the ones still inside, for the ones too scared to speak. Your presence matters more than you know. Thank you for choosing to witness. I walked into the small conference room at the immigration center feeling heavier than ever. My uniform hung loosely on me. My suitcase lay in a corner. My rosary beads slipped through my fingers as I sat across from the attorney, the one they called Diana. She had asked for a quiet local corner so we could speak without echoes or interruptions, but every word in the room still felt like it carried the weight of that house I'd left behind. Diana laid out the documents carefully. Signed forms, typed letters, printed emails. She explained what she could do. She asked about dates, about comments, about any proof of what I had endured. I remembered the day I arrived, the house, the silence, my suitcase untouched. I remembered the hallway voice asking, "She's still alive?" And I gave her the whole story. I told her of the mismatched kitchen smells, air freshener instead of home cooking, of the nights I spent in the guest room, hearing the TV and the footsteps and the nylon walls. I told her I heard the husband's voice in the hall. "We don't want questions." She stopped me when I started describing the sewing machine I sold. No, detail was too small, because in cases like this, the smallest detail often becomes proof. She said I could file for what's called humanitarian parole, a type of relief under U.S. immigration law that allows someone to remain temporarily for urgent humanitarian reasons or significant public benefit. American Immigration Council, +2. USCIS, +2. I paused. My first visit to America. My suitcase full of photos and gifts. And now I was asking for permission to stay while I fought to make sense of being rejected. The idea that I might be legally considered for protection after all I had done felt both strange and necessary. She asked me to list my health conditions, my blood pressure, my migraines, my old back wound from years of sewing in the small workshop in Michoacan. I thought about how I used to rise at dawn, fingers stained with thread, to send every cent I could to her, so my daughter could walk a different path. Now, I walked a different path, one I never wanted. We talked about the documents I had, bank statements, flight tickets, translation of the gifts I brought. We needed statements from neighbors, maybe a phone record showing my daughter's calls pulling away. We needed proof I was treated like a visitor and not a mother. The missing photos in her home, the leftover suitcase, the corrected English when I tried to speak. All of it mattered. She told me the barriers were high, that parole is discretionary, that I had to show urgent harm if I returned to Mexico. Emotional isolation counts, and that someone inside the U.S. must support my claim. She said that despite my tourist visa, despite my legal entry, my case wasn't guaranteed, that this was only the beginning. Those words should have terrified me, but strangely they offered a sliver of hope. I was no longer invisible. I had someone fighting for me. That night in the shelter, I couldn't sleep. The ceiling fan turned slowly above, the wind chimes outside the window sang softly, and I thought about what this fight meant, not just for me, but for all the mothers who sent their children ahead, all the women whose sacrifices were erased. I thought of the Haitian woman in the other bunk who said quietly, "Mine too," when I told her what happened. The solidarity in that moment hit me hard. We were invisible receipts of existence, filed away in houses and visas and debts. Weeks passed. I wrote every detail in the notebook Kelly gave me. I wrote until I had scraped out stories from corners of my past I didn't want to revisit. The night my daughter closed the photo album. The day I cooked plantains and smelled the comment about curtains. The morning the agent knocked on the door. I wrote it all, because writing felt like waking up, like saying I exist. Then one afternoon Diana called me. She said they made a decision. I held my breath. She said I would be released from detention pending the next hearings. My heart soared. I wasn't out, not fully free, but I had walked out of that room, behind bars. The air tasted different. The world looked different. I felt hope warming my bones. I walked outside into sunshine I hadn't felt in weeks. I inhaled deeply. The smell of street trees and cars and American air felt foreign and familiar at once. I promised myself I would cook rice with beans for the other women that night. Plantains, too. I would bring a little piece of home, because even if my home had changed, I had not forgotten. If you have ever had to gather your story piece by piece in a room full of paper and hope, type, "I want my voice back." Your words may help someone else know they are not alone. And if this story resonates with you, if you believe memory and justice matter, please subscribe, because together we raise voices that were meant to be silent. The shelter became more than just a temporary roof over my head. It became a place where silence was gently replaced with conversation, where eyes met without fear, where names were spoken softly, like prayers. And in that small space, filled with second-hand furniture and first chances, I found a strange kind of peace. Not because everything had been fixed, but because for the first time in weeks, no one looked at me like I was a burden. The women there came from different corners of the world: Honduras, Ethiopia, Vietnam, El Salvador, each with their own story folded in grief and stitched with hope. We would sit in the common area at night, passing tea and stories between us. There was laughter, sometimes. There were tears often. But most importantly, there was understanding. I no longer had to explain why I felt so tired or why I clutched my rosary when the wind outside got loud. They already knew. Diana continued working on my case. She came by weekly with updates. Her visits felt like sunlight cracking through heavy clouds. She brought news of a possible hearing date. She explained that the humanitarian parole was holding, and that the next step would be to present my situation to an immigration judge. I would have to share everything again, under oath, before strangers, and with all the weight of my truth. I practiced my statement with Kelly. She helped me rehearse the timeline. When I arrived, what I brought, what I heard, what I felt, I found that speaking out loud was much harder than writing. Every time I said, "my daughter," my voice broke. I had never imagined a world where that word would taste like betrayal. One evening after a practice session, I walked outside and sat on the small bench by the front steps. A car drove by with music playing low. A father was walking with his son, carrying grocery bags. The boy was laughing. I remembered walking with my own daughter like that, her tiny hand in mine, her face full of questions. She used to ask why I worked so much, and I told her I was sewing dreams into clothes, that every stitch was a step closer to something better. I never knew that one day those dreams would be used to shut me out. I wondered what she told people now. Did she say I had died? That I never came? That I went back? Did she look at her own daughter and pretend there was no one else who braided her hair first? At the shelter, I began helping in the kitchen. I cooked meals when my back allowed. I made tamales on Thursdays. I taught 2 women how to roll the dough properly, how to wrap the husks tight so they didn't break open when boiled. It wasn't much, but it made me feel useful again, like my hands still had purpose. One day, Kelly surprised me with an envelope. Inside were letters, handwritten. One from a woman in Chicago who had heard my story through a community network. Another from a young man whose grandmother had gone through something similar. And one from a girl, only 12, who wrote, "Your story made me cry. I told my mom I never want to forget where she comes from." I held those letters to my chest. I cried for a long time, not from sadness, but from the strange and powerful feeling of being seen. Truly seen, not as a problem, not as a mistake, but as a person who mattered. The judge's hearing date came. Diana prepared me. We dressed simply. I wore my oldest blouse, the one with the tiny embroidered roses at the collar. It was my mother's. I wanted her with me that day. The courtroom was colder than I expected. The judge looked tired but not unkind. The interpreter spoke slowly. Diana made her case with the strength of 1,000 voices. She told the story of sacrifice, abandonment, and resilience. She spoke of my age, my history, and my dignity. She handed over the letters, the timeline, the photographs, even the tiny note I had found in the kitchen back in that house. "There is food in the fridge. We'll be back late," as if I were a pet, not a mother. When it was my turn to speak, I stood. My knees shook. My mouth was dry. But I spoke anyway. I told them I had come to visit, not to stay, that I brought gifts, not intentions, that I had been discarded like garbage in a land I helped finance from afar. I told them my daughter had stopped looking at me like family the moment her husband asked questions, and that the questions were sharper than any rejection I had ever known. I do not know if the judge cried. I did not look up. I only remember the stillness in the room when I finished, the way even the interpreter paused, like the words had taken his breath too. We left the room without answers. "Decisions take time," Diana said, but she placed her hand on my shoulder and whispered, "You told your story. That matters." That night, I went back to the shelter. The women were waiting. They had made arroz con leche in my honor. There were paper flowers on the kitchen table. Someone had drawn a small heart next to my name on the whiteboard. If you are still listening to this and something in you aches, if you have ever stood in a room fighting to be believed, I ask you to write, "I matter too," in the comments. You never know who needs to see those words. Today. And if this story has wrapped around your heart, if it made you pause and breathe a little deeper, I invite you to subscribe, not just for the stories, but for the connection. Because here, we don't forget, we remember, together. I woke up that morning with the sun peeking through the sheer curtain of my small room at the shelter. It painted golden lines on the wooden floor, soft and warm, like fingers of light gently touching my feet. For a moment, I forgot everything. I simply lay there, listening to the birds outside, the distant sound of a bus passing by, the laughter of women in the kitchen. I inhaled deeply. The air didn't smell like bleach anymore. It smelled like life. There had been no decision yet, no final paper, no official word. But something in me had already shifted. The fight for my voice had become bigger than my pain. I wasn't just surviving detention. I wasn't just seeking legal status. I was reclaiming my place in a world that had tried to erase me, quietly. In the days that followed the hearing, something beautiful started happening. Women I didn't know began reaching out. Letters came to the shelter, messages of solidarity. Some shared stories similar to mine. Some said they had never dared to speak, but now, maybe, they would. One woman wrote, "Your voice gave mine permission to exist. I never imagined I would be heard. I thought I was too old, too foreign, too invisible to matter. But people saw me, not as a nuisance, not as a mistake, but as a mother, as a survivor, as someone worth listening to." Diana told me that our case had made its way into conversations among other advocates, that my story was being used in a workshop to train new volunteers on recognizing hidden abuse, that something I lived, something that nearly destroyed me, was now helping others avoid the same fate. I started teaching small workshops in the shelter, nothing official, just stories over tea. I taught women how to write their own narratives, how to remember dates and details, how to trust their memory. We cried together. We celebrated small victories. One woman learned how to use email for the first time and sent a message to her sister she hadn't spoken to in 11 years. Another made her first phone call to a lawyer alone. Healing isn't loud. It doesn't come with music or medals. It comes in the quiet moments, the gentle ones, like when a woman who never met you calls you Hermana, or when someone slides a folded note into your hand that simply says, "You gave me hope." I thought of my daughter often. I won't lie. There were nights when I clutched her childhood photo so tightly my fingers cramped. There were mornings when I wished for a single word from her, a message, anything. But that silence, too, became part of my healing. I stopped asking why. I started whispering, "Even without you, I am still here." One morning, Kelly arrived with fresh pastries and coffee. She said she had something for me, a framed print with hand-lettered words. It read, "The girl who arrived afraid became the woman who taught others to rise." I held it to my chest and wept, because I had arrived carrying guilt and shame, but I was leaving with dignity and purpose. To those of you who listened to every word of this story, I want to say thank you. Thank you for letting my voice reach your heart. Thank you for standing beside a stranger, for making space for my pain, and for letting me feel seen. If this story touched your soul in any way, I ask you, not just as a narrator, but as a woman who fought to be believed, to leave a comment below. Write, "You are not alone." Let someone else find those words when they need them most. Your message could be the lifeline they didn't know they were searching for. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe to this channel. Here, we hold space for stories that don't always make the headlines. Stories like mine, stories like yours. This is where pain meets purpose. This is where silence turns into strength. As this video comes to an end, another story will appear on your screen. Please watch it. Let these voices guide you. Let these truths stay with you. Because healing doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in community. It happens right here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering me. And above all, thank you for not turning away.